Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Our main guest today is Mr. Dani Rodrik. Mr. Rodrik is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at the JFK School of Government at Harvard University. He's a world-leading scholar and has written more than 20 books on globalization, economic development, and political economy. His two most recent books are concerned with inequality and the future of global trade. And today he will give us a seminar discussion on the future of globalization, manufacturing, and industrial policies. The organizer today is the Productivity Commission, which is an initiative by the 5 unions within industry, in Swedish facken inom industrin, in cooperation with the trade union think tank Arenagruppen. My name is Daniel Lind, and I'm running this project on a daily basis, and my background is I have worked as a chief economist and policy director in the Swedish trade union movement for 15 years. And the plan of the webinar is very straightforward. We have 1 hour. Mr. Rodrik gives us 45 minutes. Then will be comments and discussions by Katarina Lundahl, who is the chief economist at Unionen, which is the largest union in Sweden, and also the largest white-collar union in the world. Having said that, now we have 59 minutes left. Mr. Rodrik, we are very honored having you with us today. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can also see my slides. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. To be quite honest and upfront, at the beginning, I have not done a whole lot of thinking about Sweden. While I hope that some of the things that I'm going to be saying about my current thinking on these issues will be of some relevance to your discussions and your internal working. I do not claim any particular expertise with regard to the Swedish economy. Let me start with by laying out. I can work this presentation. I'll be able to get it to move. Let's try. Okay. So what I want to do is begin by emphasizing the main conclusions that I want to get across. So I'll state these out at the outset as 3 key ideas or key themes that I want to emphasize, and then I'll go into some greater depth in each one of these 3 areas. First, I want to say a little bit about hyperglobalization. I use hyperglobalization as a term to denote a particular kind of globalization. Hyperglobalization has been on the retreat for some time, since the global financial crisis of more than a decade ago. I don't think we should particularly bemoan the passing of hyperglobalization, as indeed there's been clearly a retreat, but I think we should use it as an opportunity to mend the visions in society that have been created as a byproduct of attachment and think about how to re-envisage the social contract. So there is a positive path ahead. It doesn't mean that we're going to be moving back to oligarchy. I don't think, in fact, that's a very likely scenario. But I don't think there's any point in trying to recreate the model of globalization that exists. Second, I want to emphasize what I think is a clear challenge of economies, societies and political systems that arise from developments in labor that are linked to globalization, but have been created by secular changes in the nature of technology. And these labor market trends, which we can sort of associate with labor market organization, some middle class, increased duality in economic life. I believe addressing them is going to require a set of industrial policies that are targeted specifically at the increasing the supply of what I call good jobs. These are relatively significant jobs that provide significant economy, life satisfaction, meaningful career ladder. So that looking at what is required for industrial policies with a particularly sort of good jobs focus, I think takes us into kind of different types of policies. In particular, I put industrial here, quotation marks, to underscore the point that these policies will not focus on the traditional focus of industrial and in manufacturing. And that takes me a third message, which is that these new industrial policies will be, I think, qualitatively quite different from our traditional approach to industrial policy in terms of incentives, focusing on manufacturing, commanding heights at the national champions in terms of global competitiveness. Instead, are likely to focus much more on the smaller and medium-sized enterprises, on services, on the domestic economy, and an entirely different sector of the economy, which are less commanding heights at the most productive sector, but the middle productive sectors of the economy. So those are the basic points. And let me start by saying a few things about globalization. I mentioned that I call the last 3 or so decades of globalization we've experienced an era of hyper-globalization. And I think it's important to underscore that kind of globalization to the 1990s was in fact a different model of globalization than what we had during much of the post-war. That the traditional model of globalization, sort of the Bretton Woods model, was one that was much more restrained, focused on tackling trade restrictions at the border, with limited scope of liberalization, essentially restricted just to manufacturing, the advanced countries, and even within manufacturing, there were significant carve-outs, as in the case of textiles and clothing, and significant increases in penetration occurred. There was very limited financial globalization. Capital account management was the norm rather than the exception. And the understanding was that each country would have significant policy space, significant autonomy to develop its own distinctive developmental or social model, that the rules of the global economy would not restrict the ability of countries to actually pursue these strategies targeted towards domestic, the creation of domestic social models. The hyper-globalization model, which is marked first by the creation of the World Trade Organization in the mid-1990s, the increased web free trade agreements, subsequently the enshrining of financial globalization as the norm rather than the exception, was actually a very different model, where increasingly domestic economic policies in services, in agriculture, in industrial policies, in health, in environment, and in intellectual properties, domestic economic policies increasingly began to be seen as trade restrictions that should be addressed and tackled, liberalized, or harmonized through international agreements. International firms, international corporations, financial institutions increasingly became agenda setters, makers. And essentially, this approach was predicated to a large extent on the convergence of different national economies. There was a single economy, world economy, that converged, and that reduced the emotion of international. And I think it's extremely important in terms of this shift in mindset that characterized hyperinflation in 1990 was that increasingly globalization came to be seen as an end rather than being, that is to say, instead of being the end of domestic economic policies and domestic economic social policies became a sort of means towards global integration. I think we can see very clearly. I won't stop you for a second because I hear a lot of chatter and I'm speaking. I don't know whether that is because you can't hear me or there's something else going on. But
Mr. Rodrik, we have problems
yes.
with the sound. Just can you click down and close Teams for a second and then open it up again? Is that possible?
You want me to log off and go back on again?
Yes, please. Can you say a word or two now?
Yes, hello everybody, good afternoon.
Yeah, it sounds much better now. Let's see, can you go back to your slides and just continue where you were? Is it possible? Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I'm trying to get my slides
okay.
back on.
Yeah, thanks.
Can you hear me?
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, so you basically didn't hear the first 15 minutes?
Some of it, not all, but now it's much better. Thanks.
So you missed all the extremely important and interesting things that I've said.
But we understood your three key ideas, and now you're talking about the first one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll need to go through this, rather quickly. So maybe we can have more discussion and back and forth. Yes. So I was talking about how sort of this new approach to globalization, which I've called hyperglobalization, is a different form. And I was going to illustrate this with a couple of quotes from leaders at the time, which referred to globalization as a kind of a physical phenomena, things that were so, immutable and inevitable. And I think these quotes very well summarize the underlying approach to globalization, which was that there was really basically nothing you could do about it, that globalization was like a force of nature, or debating globalization was like whether you should debate whether autumn follows summer. So in reality, of course, we know that we could have had many different globalization. We chose a particular one. We did not globalize labor rights, for example, even though we globalized the economic rights of cooperation. We did not negotiate global minimums for greenhouse gas emissions, but we negotiated global minimums around capital adequacy for banks or around intellectual property. A globalization that was designed around the WHO or around climate agreements would obviously be a very different globalization than one that is centered around the IMF, the WTO, or the OECD. So I think we now sort of have a better sense of the tensions that were exacerbated by hyperglobalization. One tension is around sort of economics, that it wasn't entirely clear. Again, I don't know, maybe you're not hearing me well because I have a lot of chatter. Can you hear me?
We hear you perfectly.
Okay. But I hear also a lot of background chatter, so I don't know what's happening.
It's not here. No, it's not in our room here. I don't know.
Okay. Okay.
Is it okay for you now if I close this down?
Okay, so let me try going on. So I think these I don't want to spend too much time sort of reviewing what are some of the deeper reasons for why hyperglobalization, sort of created significant amounts of fragility. Those revolve around issues that are narrowly economic in terms of the gains from trade versus the gains from productive diversification, which are in tension with each other. Issues about distributive justice and how the gains from trade are distributed, and sort of at the level of politics, questions about accountability. That is that once policymakers, as in the quotes that I gave you before from Blair or Clinton, turn to the world economy as the ultimate arbiter of where things should stand, I think there's a loss of accountability domestic. I think in many ways, the populist backlash against centrist politics is a reflection of this gap that opened up between what national policymakers claim they could do, the grievances that were exacerbated by the economic forces of globalization. So I think, just that in terms of the future of globalization, I think, certainly we can imagine bad or ugly scenarios. I don't think the bad scenario where a return to a 1930s kind of model of autarky, I don't think that's a very likely path. Because first, we've learned a lot. In the meantime, there's, the institutions of international economic cooperation are much stronger than they were in the 1930s, even if they're not very strong in themselves. And also, I think the underlying political support for open economies, despite the populist backlash, I think there's a much stronger, today than it used to be. But I think certainly we can have an ugly scenario where essentially there's, the creeping populism and protectionism that might gradually erode both liberal democracy and open world economy. I wouldn't necessarily dismiss this scenario, but my point is that there is also something good that can come out. And I think the good scenario would be a kind of a retrenchment from hyper-globalization. That's really a rebalancing between the domain of the global and the domain of the national, that effectively opens up space for a national governments to do what's required domestically. So let me now turn to the sort of what that might be. And I think that is really to address this paradox that while national economies were becoming more integrated internationally, that they were becoming domestically more disintegrated. In other words, that international economic integration actually produced domestic disintegration, creating divisions and cleavages that either did not exist or cleavages were sort of aggravated. So I think, therefore, reconstructing not just only sort of more healthy economies, but more healthy politics, I think will require kind of a reintegration of a society. And I think that, in terms of the future strategy, is going to entail moving beyond the achievement of the welfare state towards much more of a productivist agenda, a good job strategy that I want to sort of briefly sketch out in the rest of my talk. So here's sort of some graphical representation of what the challenge is. On the one hand, sort of a pattern of labor market polarization, where gap between sort of the top earners, the professionals, the highly skilled, versus those that are less skilled has opened up. And in terms of social classes, a sort of a kind of a general decline across the advanced economies, which I believe is shared by Sweden as well, of a decline in the size of the middle class. Okay, so the economic case for targeting good jobs, taking that as an important economic objective, is that good jobs produce significant externalities, that employment and innovation decisions affecting labor demand produce significant externalities, which I'll call good jobs externalities. And these good jobs externalities have been are pervasive and have been demonstrated in a series of empirical papers across the advanced countries. So the disappearance or scarcity of good jobs associated with deindustrialization, globalization shocks, austerity shocks, regional decline show up in on the one hand in terms of sort of various social traumas, rising levels of crime, drug abuse, broken families, rising rates of mortality, shows up in increase in attachment to authoritarian values, and also in political polarization and a rise of populist parties. So, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Dalbo et al. On sort of the increased labor market dualism reflecting itself in the rise of Sweden, the Sweden Democrats. The point is that when localities lose good jobs, when labor market anxieties rise, these kinds of the economic insecurity and precarity that is created creates sort of both significant social tensions and social syndromes, as well as opening up space for ethno-nationalist and authoritarian populist groups to mobilize on these economic anxieties. And so these kinds of externalities actually imply that what we might think of in the first instance as a problem of inequality or exclusion also turn into a problem of economic underperformance, also inefficiency. So that as sort of these labor market anxieties and the associated social and political costs also reflect themselves in malfunctioning of our economy. So this creates a link between these sort of inequality and exclusion and economic inefficiency. So what might those good jobs policies might look like? So I'll suggest 4 different strands of action But at a more general level, I would say that these good jobs policies are complementary to the usual ways in which we address labor market problems in terms of, collective bargaining, labor market regulation, minimum wages, or labor standards. And the argument is that those are important, but that they're not enough, because ultimately good jobs have to be underpinned by productivity growth, and productivity growth for those workers essentially in the lower and the middle part of the employment and wage distribution. And that absent that productivity growth, there is going to be necessarily a trade-off between trying to create better working conditions and employment levels in the more productive, in the more formal, in the more secure parts of the economy. So in the absence of adequate levels of productivity growth in that sort of middle level of the wage distribution, we are then necessarily going to have the kinds of syndromes that we're familiar with from European labor markets, whether it is youth unemployment or it is sort of differences in insider-outsider relations or the differences between temporary versus permanent workers in terms of employment conditions and economic security. So ultimately then, creating a good job economy is going to be possible only with a wider dissemination of productive technologies and innovation. So that means that the creating good jobs has both a enhancing the supply of labor dimension through training and skills, but also has a labor demand dimension. That is that good jobs require the creation of good firms that are more productive and can increase their employment capacity. So a lot of this, therefore, the industrial policies have to focus on the creation of these good firms that will create the labor demand. But firms themselves do not internalize the social consequences of their employment decisions. And that's why I think, quite independently from other types of industrial policies, an important dimension of industrial policy has to be on trying to get firms to internalize these good job externalities through a kind of a quid pro quo between the government and the firms. The government engages in supplying productivity enhancing services inputs to firms in exchange for these firms to commit to expand good jobs. So essentially, in these broad outlines, that is the nature of the social contract, if you will, that I have in mind. So let me, if I have to put this in the context of sort of different economic models, the good jobs policies that I'm talking about would fit into this matrix as the middle cell of this matrix. This is interventions directly in the productive sphere, that is in the employment, investment, output, innovation decisions of firms. So it's directly interventions in the production sphere, and focusing on essentially the middle segment, the middle productivity segment of the economy to raise productivity level in this sector, because ultimately this is where the labor absorbing parts of the economy are going to be. So in that way, this is different from a kind of the traditional industrial and growth policies that tend to focus much more at the high end of the economy on firms that are mostly tradable, mostly in manufacturing, mostly in the most productive segment, and the range of interventions might range from trade agreements to innovation systems, to patent rules, to R&D incentives and subsidies, to corporate tax incentives, but those are typically focused at the high end of the economy. Now, the reason that I think it's going to be important to focus on a different segment of the economy than in the traditional model with industrial and growth policies is that I think in the future, manufacturing is not going to be the leading edge of employment creation. That's already evident. But it's important to realize how small manufacturing is becoming as a labor-absorbing sector, even in economies that have been actually fairly successful in maintaining relatively robust and highly competitive, globally competitive manufacturing sectors. So let me, instead of focusing on all these countries, let me just focus on one, South Korea. And there you can see that in terms of the output share of manufacturing in the total economy, the Korean manufacturing remains very, very strong, at about 30% of the economy at constant prices. But you can see at the same time, if you look at the blue line, you can see how drastic the drop in employment has been. In fact, in none of these economies, and that, of course, would be true also, of course, in Germany, which retains a strong manufacturing. Of course, in Sweden, this has been going on for quite some time. There are many reasons why one might want to focus on manufacturing, because in many ways it is the productivity leader of the economy. There might be R&D spillovers and learning spillovers from manufacturing. But when we look at the question from the perspective of where will the good jobs come from, it's very difficult to believe that those jobs will come, or at least more than a tiny minority of those good jobs will come from manufacturing per se. So therefore, we need to shift our focus, I think, away from manufacturing. I might also sort of compare this model with the standard welfare state model. Again, caricaturing somewhat, I think the welfare state model would be a combination of investments in primary endowments, such as in health, education, which are sort of these pre-production column, together with quite significant tax and transfer and safety nets and social insurance policies, which are sort of post-production interventions. Now, the problem of the welfare state model from the current perspective is that the traditional welfare state model presumes that these good middle-class jobs are going to be available to all once you provide adequate production, adequate education, and therefore essentially focuses on social insurance against idiosyncratic risks to ensure that people who fall through the cracks are covered. And that's why it focuses on these pre-production and post-production sets of interventions. But I would argue that the labor market ills of today, the inequality and insecurity, feelings of economic precarity, are much more of a structural problem. That is, that inadequacy in the supply of good jobs is driven by these secular tendencies in technology, in deindustrialization, in globalization. And that when these secular trends hollow out the middle of the employment distribution, then we're going to have a kind of a structural problem that exhibits itself in the form of precarious jobs, bad jobs, or continuously or permanently depressed regions that are doing very poorly in terms of creating employment. And therefore, this is going to require a strategy that tackles the supply of good jobs, the creation of good jobs directly. And traditional welfare state policies are important, but because they don't address the problem at source, which is in the productive sphere, they will at best cover the symptoms, will address the symptoms of the problem rather than the heart of the problem. Okay, so I said earlier that I would suggest sort of four broad planks for this strategy, and let me lay them out here. So one is on the labor supply side would be labor market policies, active labor market policies, having invest with sort of investments in skill and training that is very closely linked to employers. That is, and that to some extent is already something that many European nations, I think including Sweden, has been moving towards. So having systems of training and education and vocational training that is very closely linked to the needs of employers, and also takes into account the needs of the workers through the provision of what in the US is called wraparound services to ensure that those who do need those training can in fact take part in the labor market, and there are various needs, whether it is language problems for immigrants or whether it is problems with transportation or childcare can also be addressed. So that's sort of one plank, probably is the most traditional one, but I think it's obviously an important one that addressing problems in labor supply and human capital and training. The second would be on the labor demand side, sort of reorienting our industrial regional policies in a way that directly targets the supply of good jobs. And that's sort of going back to the theme that I've been stressing from the beginning. The idea here being that we should not imagine that that industrial policies that generically target productivity or global competitiveness or digitalization or the climate change challenge, all of which might be worthy and important. Certainly climate change is the most important among all. As important and worthy as all of these might be, I think they're not necessarily directly going to be addressing the issue of good jobs, and unless we make that an end in and of itself. Third, in a way, most challenging, I think, are rethinking our innovation policies to understand that just we can orient our R&D systems, our innovation systems, in the direction, for example, of inducing green technologies, clean technologies, or for that matter, military technologies. We can also orient our innovation policies in a direction that enhances and augments semi-skilled labor or skilled labor with skills in the middle of the employment and wage distribution. So that is that technology trends in technology are more labor friendly rather than simply labor replacing or labor displacing. So this, I think, is an important new way of thinking about the direction of technological change and internalizing the idea that it's endogenous. Fourth, and I'm not going to say much more about that. It sort of goes back to the theme that I started out with, which is that going back to the issues of globalization and international economic integration, even though most of this good jobs agenda is a domestic agenda, it's a national agenda, it's important to ensure that forces of global competition and global arbitrage in labor or labor rights doesn't undermine this domestic good jobs agenda. And so that might mean both to ensure that there is kind of a shift in the tax base away from labor more towards capital. And I think the recent move towards establishing a global minimum for corporate income taxation is certainly a move in the right direction. Or thinking in the context of European trade policies, for example, a social anti-dumping clause that would prevent the undermining of high road policies domestically by low road policies or very weak labor protections in exporting countries where labor rights are severely violated. So thinking about how trade policy can be used to protect domestic labor and social standards would be sort of the final plank of this. I think these different elements of this program are connected both by a common objective of increasing the quantity of good jobs, but also a kind of a new form of governance, a new form of regulation, which is much less top-down, which is much more collaborative with social partners, which is much more iterative, starts out with open-ended goals. The notion of a good job itself, of course, is highly subjective and has to be developed. And it involves a set of ongoing experimental arrangements between private and state actors. It will involve much more closer coordination between active labor market policies on the one hand and industrial policies on the other, rather than subsidies and ex-ante incentives. It would rely much more on the provision of productivity-enhancing and customized business services to smaller and medium-sized enterprises. It would explicitly target employment and job upgrading. So, having explicit quantitative targets for good jobs, provisional, but still explicit targets would be part of this. And because of inherent uncertainty, there would be room for constant iteration and revision of targets and procedures. These are already types of governance that are embedded, a lot of existing arrangements, whether it is, sort of the regulation of groundwater in European environmental regulations, whether it is the model of DARPA in the United States, whether it is the existing model of workforce development that are highly customized and take many of these forms of governance in its actual practice. So these types of governance mechanisms are already in operation in diverse parts of policy and economic life. But I think they would need to be much more center as we think about these good job policies as a kind of a strategy. So I'm running out of time here. So I just want to maybe say just one more word about the importance of the third of these items, and I'll end on this. This was the idea of thinking about innovation policies or innovation systems in a way that can be used to redirect our innovation energies towards more labor-friendly technologies. And I think here I want to countervail against a very common view on the relationship between technology and labor markets, which is that essentially it puts all the onus of adjustment on labor, on our workforce, and very little on the process of on the direction of technological change, as if technological change was something that's completely exogenous, that could not be influenced. So the standard kind of line here is, and I've just sort of paraphrased thousands or hundreds of different commission reports or international bodies reports on the relationship between technology and labor markets. You get something like this, that technology is rapidly changing the skills needed on the job, and workers need to adjust through increased education and continuous training. So that's what I mean by putting essentially all the onus of adjustment on society, on workers, on labor. But I think the mistake in thinking of technology in this way is that it treats technology as a completely exogenous force. But we know that direction of technology responds to a variety of things. It responds to the incentives that we have in our existing prices, in our existing tax system. So, if we have a lot of taxes on labor, but we subsidize investment in physical capital, then of course we're going to get a lot of automation, not all of it socially beneficial. It responds to private and public norms about, our narratives about what kind of innovation we ought to be seeking to achieve. And also, it depends on on relative bargaining power. Who gets to say in the workplace on what types of technology are developed, what kind of technologies are adopted, how they are deployed. So relative bargaining power also matters. So I think what I'm trying to argue here is that for countries that have significant commitment to R&D and innovation in the advanced countries, and I would certainly put Sweden in that category, I think we need to think about consciously how our innovation systems can be used to redirect innovation in a more labor-friendly direction. So those are thinking about digital tools and AI and other new technologies that augment rather than replace labor. In fact, enhance the productivity of workers that are sort of in the middle of the skill distribution, rather than simply replace them. So giving them, giving teachers or care workers or nurses or others the kinds of tools where they can provide more customized services, can address sort of niche markets, can have continuous feedback through AI or digital tools on how they're performing, how their customers are responding. That might simultaneously increase the demand for their services and also make them more productive at what they do. I think, again, there are models of these kinds of innovations, but I don't think we've internalized this idea that we need to think about our innovation systems in a way that redirects them much more in a way that enhances labor rather than that displaces lower or middle skilled workers. So all the European discussions that I've seen, for example, on promoting innovation is on climate change, which is very important, again, the climate transition, or the digital economy. But essentially, in terms of the labor or social implications, it's all about compensating the losers or, having transfers, but not seriously thinking about how technology itself can be reoriented in a more socially useful manner. So, okay, let me just stop here. I have not been hearing any chatter or anything. It's been complete silence at the other end, and I don't see anybody on the screen except for my slide and myself. I hope I have not been talking to myself for the last half hour, but I'm just going to stop it right here.
Many thanks, Mr. Rodrik. We are sitting here listening to you. So you have been a decent audience here. And now the next step is to introduce Katarina. Katarina Lundahl is the chief economist at Unionen, as I said. And she has 15 minutes to discuss with you on certain topics on your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me also, Mr. Rodrik.
I can.
Perfect. Thank you. Great being here. And it's an honor to be able to comment on your very interesting thoughts, Mr. Rodrik. And I will do that from a Swedish perspective, sort of take your ideas and put them into the Swedish context. And I will focus my comment on sort of 3 areas, and that is our view on the globalization and on your thoughts about it, and also more specifically also what has happened in the Swedish labor market. I mean, you talked about this polarization. What is the Swedish experience? And then at last, what are the policy responses here in Sweden, and how has the Swedish social partners responded to the different challenges that globalization and technological change has posed to workers on the labor market. But first, starting with globalization, and I think your thoughts here were very interesting about this period of hyper-globalization. And what I take with me from this is also that I think some think that, okay, now that this previously very sort of strong period of globalization is over, then globalization will be dead. And I think that's wrong, and I think, I mean, even if you talked about different scenarios, globalization is continuing. And for example, now we have a larger trade than we had before the pandemic, even though we had a slump. So sort of global trade and the globalization is continuing. And I think one force also that we have now is the technological change, which makes it much easier to compare, to compete, and to exchange ideas fast and globally. And even if people put up trade barriers, you cannot put up barriers for exchanging thoughts that easily, even though some leaders might try. So I think that is a driving force behind the global competition in this sort of digital age. But I also think that some features of globalization will change, and maybe, as you've put it, also should change. And one thing that is obvious now is that trade becomes more regional in blocks, like in Europe, Asia, America. And I think that has sort of probably several different reasons behind it. But one is that before it was driven much, one driving force behind global trade was low labor costs in countries where the costs are not as low anymore, and also production costs have increased in the home countries because of technological change and automation. And also what we hear when we talk to our members and their companies is that sustainability issues are on the agenda in a very different way these days than they were maybe a decade ago or so. Even though Sweden has a long time been sort of in the front line, even here it's since some years is very high up on the agenda. And therefore, when they are looking for suppliers, when they are thinking about their value chain, sustainability is an issue in a very different way. And then it can be sort of what is decisive when you choose between a supplier close by or one far away. I think in a different way than sort of before this issue was on the agenda in a way that it is now. But I think we will continue sort of to search for suppliers far away as well when that is beneficial and it's motivated. And of course, for a small country like Sweden and a very, very export-dependent one, it's very important with free competition and continued free trade. And there, I guess that in some ways the jury is still out. What will happen now? There are, of course, and have been for some time, worrying trends of more barriers ways. But I think there are also, logics for continued global trade that I hope will prevail. But I think also Sweden will have to keep working hard, not at least in the EU context, arguing for free trade and competition. You talked about the industry being sort of less important in these days, and I agree with you, Mr. Rodrik, in terms of that the service sector in Sweden and in most other advanced economies have increased in scale and scope. And in Sweden, it's the service sector that has had the largest growth of new jobs and high-qualified jobs the last decade. But the industry is still important in Sweden, both in terms of jobs, but also in terms of where these jobs are located. In smaller cities, towns, they can be very, very important still. And it's also a fact that one job in the industry creates 1.5 jobs in the service sector and in other parts of the economy. And looking at Sweden and the Swedish industry, I mean, we've long been an industrial nation. we had a very rough patch around the financial crisis. Not least our automotive industry got a very hard hit in that crisis. And a famous quote is from our then Prime Minister, who in 2013 at the Davos meeting said, well, the Swedish industry is basically gone, if I paraphrase it, Mr. Reinfeldt. And I think that was of course wrong. We had 600,000 people working in the industry, but that was part of the feeling at that time that the industry is not the future. And I think no Swedish politician would say that today because of several reasons. But one is that the Swedish industry has had a real revival since then. And everyone understands that they are important, even though you should and cannot focus on them alone or specifically. So they are an important part of the Swedish economy. And but it's also a part that is under very large transformation pressure, not least connected to sustainability issues. And the picture here on my slide is of Kvarnsvedens pappersbruk, a paper plant that was recently closed and that is now taken over by Northvolt, a battery production company. And it was actually on the Swedish news this morning about their overtaking of this facility, and the CEO of Northvolt saying that they will now plan to create 1,000 jobs in Borlänge, a quite small town, compared with the 450 jobs that previously existed on this site. And for such a town as Borlänge, I think this will be hugely important. And it is also in a region which has not had as good job development as some other regions, as like the big cities. So I think it is important for them. And also to be in the front line of this new tradition of this transformation of battery technology, sustainable development is also creating lots of high-skilled jobs in the service sector, research and development and other things. So I think it's important for Sweden to be well placed in this development. And as it looks right now, we are on a good way of being that. You did not talk about the EU's industrial policy, and I don't blame you. It's quite a complicated thing that maybe it only interests Europeans, but it is for us quite an important, I think, piece of policy work happening at the moment, and not only from a positive perspective. There are definite risks to this industrial policy agenda from the EU side, and that they are focusing in a way on industrial policy from a more old type of perspective that you talked about also, that pinpointing certain industries the way one used to do it, was sort of trying to copy or image maybe China and other countries and sort of growing certain types of industries. That maybe can be motivated in certain areas, but there are definitely risks to that, and risks of not really being successful but costing lots of money, and also of putting different market principles out of play. For example, if you have already invested lots in sort of making your business sustainable, and then EU throws lots of money on those who have not done anything. So there's a question of what sort of incentives that will create. And also for a small country like Sweden, another question is how good will we be to get the investments, to get the funds and get part of these different programs and funds that EU will provide. So to my third part on what has happened to Swedish jobs. And just as you described the general development with polarization, that has partly been the case also in Sweden, with the degrees of the sort of mid-income jobs. But in Sweden we have, I think compared to what you have showed, have had a a large growth of high-skilled jobs and a rather smaller one of the low-skilled. And that means we've, to a quite large extent, managed to sort of upskill those who have lost their mid-income jobs. And if you look at how it looks for men and women, it is also obvious that this is particularly true for women. Women are upscaled. For men, it's a bit more of a dual picture of both upskilling and sort of downskilling. And one can then wonder how come we have been relatively successful in upskilling. And I think there are several reasons to this. We have a tradition in Sweden of not protecting particular jobs, but protecting workers. We have also a tradition of focusing on reskilling, and the social partners have particular organizations that help people who get out of a job to skill them and get them so they can get a new one. So we have a long tradition of that, and that as I think has created also a mindset of that companies are allowed to go bankrupt and should do that, and we want productive companies that create good jobs. So there is I think in general, and I think compared to some other countries, a larger acceptance for that in the workforce. But there are, of course, also even in the Swedish labor market, groups that has not fared as well. We have groups of individuals that have never even entered the Swedish labor market. So it's not that they've gone from the mid-income jobs to low income. They have sort of always been in the low income or living on welfare. So that is sort of one problem needs that we are struggling with, even though there has been an increase in the labor participation rate recent years in foreign-born individuals, which is positive. And even though we have been relatively successful in this sort of transformation of jobs and labor markets, I think that is no reason for sort of being content and thinking that we will absolutely continue to be that. It will be continued transformation and large needs for reskilling and moving people to the good jobs that you talked about. And also I think the interesting thoughts you've presented concerning also the policies connected to innovation and new technologies. And I completely agree that I think innovation in many fronts is the best friend of many in the labor market. The technologies and the AI can do the sort of the tedious work, and we can do what humans are better at. So I think, but we need to use the technologies in the right way, and also small companies need to understand how they can use the technology, which is not easy. But I think also in Sweden we are in a period of a major reform that is coming into place in October during this year, concerning the abilities for everyone in the labor market who has worked some years to get more education. It's a new public financial student aid program, which means that if you have worked, say, for 7 years, you can have 1 year of basically paid leave and train or study anything you want, as long as it's deemed to increase or enhance your standing in the labor market. And it's the individual itself who decides if you want to do this or not, and you don't have to be unemployed or have lost your jobs. And we see this from Unionen and the Union's side as a very, very important reform for this sort of transformation process. And it's important also, it's not pinpointed at a certain industry or a certain type of jobs, but it's a general reform. And I think persons usually know best themselves what are their skills, what are the opportunities, and where do they need to enhance their skills, with some support from people who can guide them and advise them, which is how the setup is also. Another reform which we hope will come in place this year is called etableringsjobb in Swedish, establishment jobs, as my sort of Swinglish translation, which is another initiative from the social partners, and that aim is to get people with a weak standing in the Swedish labour market to sort of get a foot into the labour market. Low cost for the employer and on-the-job training for a 2-year period. So we hope that will also help to address some of the other problems in the labour market. Thank you.
Ooh, that was Sweden. Thank you, Katarina. Just 1 or 2 comments from your side, Danny. Reflection from your perspective on the Swedish presentation from Katarina here, please.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank Katarina. I think that was very, very useful. And obviously, Sweden has a wonderful tradition of partnership between the government, business, and the labor movement. And I think the kind of initiatives that I just heard about, such as the public financing of these of educational sabbaticals for workers after every 7 years or so. I think this is a great initiative. I wonder. So the question that I have from an outsider's perspective, again, is this insider outsider in the relatively large number of temporary workers in the Swedish labor market, which seems to be driving much of this dualism in the labor market. So the question is, presumably those who are on temporary contracts would not be eligible for that. Is the last reform that you mentioned, is that trying to integrate the temporary workers into the organized permanent contracts? And also a little bit about those who are left behind, if you can say something about that. I mean, I imagine people who are not native speakers, refugees, immigrants, sort of those would be, in part, some of those who might be having the greatest difficulty in incorporating themselves into the organized high productivity jobs. So, what are the policies with respect to those?
Yes, thank you. Very good question. This financing possibility will be, as I understand it, possible also if you've had temporary contracts, as long as you've had them for if you sum them for a certain time period. So it doesn't have to be a fixed employment. So you can have had many different temporary employments. As long as you have been working, you are eligible for this support. So I think it will, as long as you've been in the labor market in some form, you will be covered, basically. But of course, then there are those who have not been in the labor market at all, and those we hope this other reform can be one way of helping, but I'm sure there may also be need for other types of reforms for this group. Then in general, I think, even though we have a group that has a difficulty coming into the labor market, we see at least for white-collar workers, there's no decrease in the share of permanent jobs. So people are still getting permanent jobs in the same degree, even though the labor market is increasing, the share is the same. So I think we seem to have a fairly well-functioning labor market in the way that most people are getting permanent jobs or temporary contracts and then continuing into permanent jobs. But then there are certain smaller groups where that is not the case.
Just as an information for you, Mr. Rodrik, this new system is a result of a negotiation between the social partners. So on the other side, the employers can argue that they have won some changes in the labor laws. So there's a kind of a trade-off here. And the government is supporting it with money to get it going in reality. So having said that, the time has passed 4. Many thanks to Mr. Rodrik. Very thoughtful for me and very well-structured presentation. And thank you, Katarina, for your comments. And as for you, Mr. Rodrik, we will have Paul Antras here, your colleague in Harvard, in October, discussing globalization and global value chains. So we are continue to learn more and discuss more. Very nice to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.